Part 2 of Chapter 4 of Little Eve Edgarton. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Little Eve Edgarton by Eleanor Hallowell Abbott. Part 2 of Chapter 4. For 5 minutes by the little traveling clock she heard him pacing monotonously up and down, up and down. Then very softly at last she summoned him back to her. "Father," she whispered, "I think there's someone knocking at the outside door." "What?" called Edgarton. Incredulously he came back through his daughter's room and crossing over to the hall door yanked it open abruptly on the intruder. "Why, good afternoon," grinned Barton above the extravagantly large and languorous bunch of pale lavender orchids that he clutched in his hand. "Good afternoon," said Edgarton without enthusiasm. Orchids," persisted Barton still grinningly. Across the unfriendly hunch of the older man's shoulder he caught a disquieting glimpse of a girl's unduly speculative eyes. In sudden impulsive league with her against this, their apparent common enemy, age, he thrust the orchids into the older man's astonished hands. "For me?" questioned Edgarton icily. "Why, yes, certainly," beamed Barton. "Orchids, you know. Hothouse orchids," he explained painstakingly. "So I judged," admitted Edgarton. With extreme distaste he began to untie the soft, flimsy lavender ribbon that encompassed them. "In their native state, you know," he confided, "one very seldom finds them growing with sashes on them." From her nest of cushions across the room little Eve Edgarton loomed up suddenly into definite prominence. "What did you bring me, Mr. Barton?" she asked. "Why, Eve!" cried her father. "Why, Eve, you astonish me! Why, I'm surprised at you! Why, what do you mean?" The girl sagged back into her cushions. "Oh, Father," she faltered, "don't you know anything? That was just small talk." With perfunctory courtesy Edgarton turned to young Barton. "Pray be seated," he said. "Take a chair." It was the chair closest to little Eve Edgarton that Barton took. "How do you do, Miss Edgarton?" he ventured. "How do you do, Mr. Barton?" said little Eve Edgarton. From the splashy washstand somewhere beyond them they heard Edgarton fussing with the orchids and mumbling vague Latin imprecations or endearments over them. A trifle surreptitiously Barton smiled at Eve. A trifle surreptitiously Eve smiled back at Barton. In this perfectly amiable exchange of smiles the girl reached up suddenly to the sides of her head. "Is my bandage on straight?" she asked worriedly. "Why, no," admitted Barton. "It ought not to be, ought it?" Again, for no special reason whatsoever, they both smiled. "Oh, I say," stammered Barton, "how you can dance!" Across the girl's olive cheeks her heavy eyelashes shadowed down like a fringe of black ferns. "Yes, how I can dance," she murmured almost inaudibly. "Why didn't you let anybody know?" demanded Barton. "Yes, why didn't I let anybody know?" repeated the girl in an utter panic of bashfulness. "Oh, I say," whispered Barton, "won't you even look at me?" Mechanically the girl opened her eyes and stared at him fixedly until his own eyes fell. "Eve," called her father sharply from the next room, "where in creation is my data concerning North American orchids?" "In my steamer trunk," began the girl, "on the left hand side, tucked in between your riding boots and my bast hat." "Oh!" called her father. Barton edged forward in his chair and touched the girl's brown, boyish little hand. "Really, Miss Eve," he stammered, "I'm awfully sorry you got hurt. Truly I am. Truly it made me feel awfully squeamish. Really I've been thinking a lot about you these last few days. Honestly I have. Never in all my life did I ever carry any one as little and hurt as you were. It sort of haunts me, I tell you. Isn't there something I could do for you?" "Something you could do for me?" said little Eve Edgarton staring. Then again the heavy lashes came shadowing down across her cheeks. "I haven't had any very great luck," she said, "in finding you ready to do things for me." "What?" gasped Barton. The big eyes lifted and fell again. "There was the attic," she whispered a bit huskily. "You wouldn't rent me your attic." "Oh, but I say," grinned Barton. "Some real thing, I mean. Couldn't I read aloud to you?" he articulated quite distinctly as Edgarton came rustling back into the room with his arms full of papers. "Read aloud?" gibed Edgarton across the top of his spectacles. "It's a daring man in this unexpurgated day and generation who offers to read aloud to a lady." "He might read me my geology notes," suggested little Eve Edgarton blandly. "Your geology notes?" hooted her father. "What's this? Some more of your new fangled small talk? Your geology notes?" Still chuckling mirthlessly, he strode over to the big table by the window and, spreading out his orchid data over every conceivable inch of space, settled himself down serenely to compare one flower of mystery with another. Furtively for a moment Barton sat studying the gaunt, graceful figure. Then quite impulsively he turned back to little Eve Edgarton's scowling face. "Nevertheless, Miss Eve," he grinned, "I should be perfectly delighted to read your geology notes to you. Where are they?" "Here," droned little Eve Edgarton, slapping listlessly at the loose pile of pages beside her. Conscientiously Barton reached out and gathered the flimsy papers into one trim handful. "Where shall I begin?" he asked. "It doesn't matter," murmured little Eve Edgarton. "What?" said Barton. Nervously he began to fumble through the pages. "Is there any beginning?" he demanded. "No," moped little Eve Edgarton. "Nor any end?" he insisted. "Nor any middle?" "No," sighed little Eve Edgarton. Helplessly Barton plunged into the unhappy task before him. On page 9 there were perhaps the fewest blots. He decided to begin there. "Paleontologically," the first sentence smote him. "Paleontologically the periods are characterized by absence of the large marine saurians, dinosaurs and pterosaurs." "Eh?" gasped Barton. "Why, of course!" called Edgarton a bit impatiently from the window. Laboriously Barton went back and reread the phrase to himself. "Oh, yes," he conceded lamely. "Paleontologically " he began all over again. "Oh, dear no," he interrupted himself. "I was farther along than that. Absence of marine saurians. Oh, yes. Absence of marine saurians," he resumed glibly. "Dinosaurs and pterosaurs so abundant in the Cretaceous of ammonites and belemnites," he persisted heroically. Hesitatingly, stumblingly, without a glimmer of understanding, his bewildered mind worried on and on, its entire mental energy concentrated on the single purpose of trying to pronounce the awful words. "Of rootists, inocerami, trigonias," the horrible paragraph tortured on. "By the marked reduction in the brachiopods compared with the now richly developed gasteropods and sinupalliate lamellibranchs," it writhed and twisted before his dizzy eyes. Every sentence was a struggle. More than one of the words he was forced to spell aloud just out of sheer self-defense, and always against Eve Edgarton's little intermittent nod of encouragement was balanced that hateful sniffing sound of surprise and contempt from the orchid table in the window. Despairingly he skipped a few lines to the next unfamiliar words that met his eye. "The Neozoic flora," he read, "consists mainly of angiosperm." Still smiling, but distinctly wan around the edges of the smile, he slammed the handful of papers down on his knees. "If it really doesn't make any difference where we begin, Miss Eve," he said, "for heaven's sake let's begin somewhere else." "Oh, all right," crooned little Eve Edgarton. Expeditiously Barton turned to another page and another. Wryly he tasted strange sentence after strange sentence. Then suddenly his whole wonderful face wreathed itself in smiles again. "Three superfamilies of turtles," he began joyously.